see or hear this, even if you're having problems in in the system. We started a new series last week called Tough as Nails. And I'll admit, this is the series that's going to make you really completely comfortable or enthusiastic. What I hope it does is I hope it helps you to see that Jesus is at the center of our existence, and we need to learn not only to imitate him, but to fix our eyes on him, to keep our eyes on him when everything else is going crazy around us. You know, one of the things that I think we sometimes lose track of is, what do you do when you hear, and if you hear, but she's a Christian, or my next door neighbor just moved in and it turns out they're a Christian, or my boss is a Christian. What comes to your mind when you hear that word Christian? Now, understand the word Christian was not what the New Testament called believers. It was not something. The word Christian was created by the Romans as a derogatory term. It was meant to say that we were little Christ. So, and I'm afraid the world hears the word Christian, and let's be honest. Most of the world, when you hear the word Christian, especially in America, what people think is, oh, you're one of those. You're narrow-minded. You're a bigot. You're hateful. You're holier than thou. You're a hypocrite. You got all these rules. But I'm going to tell you the honest truth, first century Christians weren't seen that way. They weren't. The fact is that first century Christians were a little feared. Came across some writing by a Roman doctor. He's a pagan. He is not a Christian. But after he was part of the team that after the lions were set loose upon the Christians in the Colosseum, he would go in afterwards. Number one, to make sure they're dead, but number two, because Roman law said that you couldn't touch a dead body except to bury it. That's the only thing you weren't allowed to do anything medically, so they didn't do autopsies. He would go in and examine the ones who were still alive to learn how to, learn about anatomy. And in his writings, he said that these Christians were absolutely fearless, that they would go to their deaths in faith, and he just was absolutely awed. These people were, nothing fazed them. And he didn't understand what was wrong with them, that they had this hope, they had this joy, they had this peace in the midst of being ripped apart by wild animals. They weren't afraid of anything. Death, poverty, illness, nothing. They didn't fear loss. He just didn't get it. But see, that's what the hope of Jesus Christ in us is supposed to do. They didn't fear loss. I mean, that's an amazing thought. I mean, they held each other together. They introduced others first. power for the powerless, work as unto the Lord, fear when there was so much to fear. I mean, you're talking about a society where they were rounded up and executed for their faith. And you might say, well, that was just the New Testament. That, you know, that's just history, and that really doesn't happen now. And yes, it does. Yes, it does. In China, in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan. Believers die for their faith. The thing is, they make a huge impact on the world around them. Those people watch how they die. And they don't care how you believe and how strong your faith is in other religions. When you watch a man calmly sacrifice himself, not to blow others up, but to die for their faith, calmly accept what the Lord has put in their lives, deal with poverty, deal with, I mean, you know, we tend to think, oh, you know, the worst thing that can happen is in a society is that you get killed for your faith. But see, that's not actually the worst thing society can do to you. They can put you in ghettos. They can strip you of all power. They can take rights. Germany went through that during World War II when they started doing it to Jews. But what most people don't realize is that during World War II, they didn't just kill 6 million Jews. They killed 1.5 million Christians in Nazi Germany. So we never talk about that because they refused to bend their faith. We're not talking about just church members. We're talking about actual Christians. People who live their faith out on a day-to-day basis. Not tolerated either. Because those kind of people can stand by and watch Jews being rounded up and slaughtered. That's true faith, folks. Faith that says, I care about others. I don't fear what the world can take away from me. Because the worst it can do to me is take my life. And guess what, guys? All that is a one-way ticket home. The first century church didn't fear loss. They held everything together. They were selfless. They were confident. Their confidence came from something other than themselves. It wasn't that they thought they were so great. It's that they realized that who they clung to, who they found everything in, was Jesus Christ. They weren't arrogant. They were not self-confident. They were humble. Like their confidence comes from something other than themselves. Christian is a Christ follower, a Jesus follower. So Christians should look like Jesus. In fact, the word itself means little Christ. Christian was a derogatory term that said we were imitators of Christ. Well, I got news for you folks. I can't think of anybody I would rather imitate than my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I don't know about you. Oh, and guys, I realize that there's pictures up and you say, oh, this is what Jesus looks like. Well, I got news for you. That's not what he was. Jesus was not Wilbur Milquetoast. No. We get this image of Jesus as this wimpy little guy who just let everybody walk all over him. But Jesus was really as tough as nails. Peter was solid as a rock. Paul was stronger than steel. I mean, look at Jesus. He knew what was coming. And yet he rode into Jerusalem knowing what was going to happen to him. He walked into the temple and saw them ripping people off with the money changers in the Gentile court, so the Gentiles couldn't even come in and worship. And what did he do? He cleared the court by himself. You think that's Wilbur Milquetoast? You think that's some kind of wimp? That's not my Savior. My Savior is not a wimp. My Savior was strong. My Savior is strong. In fact, he's stronger than anything else on this planet. And then you had Peter. Peter, who, after he became a believer, and guys, most people don't think about this, but prior to Jesus Christ's death and resurrection, there were no other Christians. There were no Christians on this planet. The disciples weren't believers at that point. They were just disciples. But with his death and resurrection, they were believers. Peter was transformed. I mean, it's amazing to watch the change from Peter, who denied him 3 times on the night of the crucifixion, to in the city boldly preaching the resurrection, being arrested and going right back out and doing it again. And then there was Paul. Paul, who was originally about as evil as it came, was converted and proclaimed the gospel throughout the known world. Who, knowing when his time was there, went back to Jerusalem, knowing he was arrested and that he would be tried and he'd be executed for his faith. But he didn't fear death, because he had his Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And I look at all that, and I look at the early church, and you read the stories of the Fox Book of Martyrs, and you see the things that believers do in the rest of the world. And then I ask myself, what happened to us? What happened to us? First, Christians, irresistible, fearless, when there was so much to fear. Introduced others first, one another. Power for the powerless, work us into the Lord. And then there's us. The church in America. The modern church. Who is impacted more by the world than we impact the world. And I believe that Hebrews 11 speaks to us for that very reason. Is it worth what Christianity demands of us? Hebrews 11. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. For by faith, trust, and holy fervor, men of old had divine testimony borne to them and obtained a good report. These people all died for their faith. His confidence that God will do what he promised to do. Not a power. Not something that says, oh, you know, this is what... No, faith is not that. Faith is God saying, this is what I will do, and you believe him. Very simple. I believe God. I believe that He's in control. I believe that in His name, He will complete His mission. Let's face it, if someone you trust makes you a promise, behave as if he or she will keep that promise, although you haven't seen it yet. Guys, that's exactly what God is saying. In the Old Testament, the men and women who are spoken of in Hebrews 11 believed God, and it was counted to them as the righteousness. Moses did not see the resurrection, and yet he believed God and obeyed God. And he was redeemed for that reason. The people in the Old Testament, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, believed God. And God said He would send a Messiah. And God said He would redeem them. And they believed that that was coming. And because they believed God, they were redeemed. Isn't that really what being a follower of the way, what the Old Testament, what the New Testament church was called? They were followers of the way. And of course the way was Jesus Christ. Followers of the way. I mean, let's face it, we do that in our real life. I mean, you go to work, you don't necessarily understand the beginning, and you had confidence in what you hoped for, assurance based on the character of your employer of what you had not seen. I mean, think about that. Your first 2 weeks at work, you didn't know what was going on, and you had to trust people. Whether you wanted to or not, you had to trust them. You worked by faith. And the author lists Old Testament characters, Noah, Sarah, Abraham, behaved as if God would keep His promises. And all those people were still living by faith when they died. They never received the things promises. Abraham was told that his descendants would be as the sand on the beach, uncountable. Yet when Abraham died, he had one son and a daughter-in-law. They never got to see the fulfillment of the promise. They only knew that this is what God said would happen, and it did. Some of these people faced jeers and flogging and even chains and in prison. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and mistreated. That was the early church, folks. In Iraq, if you're Muslim and you convert to Christianity, you can be executed for your faith. If you're not, you can lose your job, you can lose your home, your family will have a funeral for you, and they will declare you dead, and they will throw you out into the streets, and you will get no support or help. I know a young lady who grew up in India, and you think, oh, India's a modern, it's not like Iraq. Well, in India, she was Hindu, and she became a Christian. When she told her parents, they stripped her naked and threw her out the front door. And then they held a funeral for her, because to them, she was dead. She was eventually taken in by a Christian missionary in the area and provided clothing and a house and a place to live. But her faith immediately cost her all except her life. There was once a version of faithfulness to God that elicited heroic living. It was awe-inspiring. That's the early church. These people all died, controlled and sustained by their faith, not having received the tangible fulfillment of God's promises, only having seen it and greeted it from a distance by faith, and all the whole while acknowledging and confessing they were strangers and temporary residents and exiles upon this earth. Those were commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. Since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. God had a plan. God's plan was fulfilled and perfected through them and us. Hebrews 12, 1-4. Teaches us that God is at work. That God is fulfilling His plan. Therefore, so what should we do? How do we respond? Therefore then, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses who have borne testimony to the truth, let us strip off and throw aside every encumbrance, every unnecessary weight, and that sin which so readily, deftly, and cleverly clings to and entangles us. Let us run with patience, endurance, and steady and active persistence the appointed course of the race that is set before us, looking away from all that will distract to Jesus, who is the leader and the source of our faith, giving the first incentive for our belief, and is also, it is finished. It is also its finisher, bringing it to maturity and perfection. He, for the joy of obtaining the prize, was set before him, endured the cross, despising and ignoring the shame, and is now seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Just think of him who endured from sinners such grievous opposition and bitter hostility. Reckon up and consider all in comparison with your trials, so that you may not grow weary or exhausted, losing heart and relaxing and fainting in your minds. You have not yet struggled and fought arrogantly and agonizingly against sin, nor have you yet resisted and withstood to the point of pouring out your own blood. We are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses who paid an extraordinary price for their faith to ensure that we would know the story of faith. Every last one of the 11 disciples, with the exception of Judas, sacrificed all to proclaim the gospel. Peter was crucified upside down. Thomas was speared to death, sharing the gospel in India. John was exiled to the island of Patmos. He's the only one who didn't die for his faith. In that traditional sense, he wasn't murdered. He was exiled to starve out the rest of his life. That cloud of witnesses paid an extraordinary price for the faith so that we would know the story. And it didn't just end with the New Testament. Far be it for me to say that it did, because I know it didn't. In our world today, there are people who are dying for their faith. We see the pictures in the news of believers rounded up in countries where ISIS runs. Lined up, kneeling on the beach, drowned in the rivers, suffocated, strangled, beheaded, and shot. Several years ago, there was an ethnic cleansing in Somalia. Somalia, the churches were burned and destroyed. We live in a world where it is becoming more and more violent against believers. But we're not alone. America has been blessed, and we have a lot of blessings here. God has given us so much with our religious freedom. But what I'm afraid of is that religious freedom, we've allowed it to become complacent. Because the early church paid a huge price waiting for. And I'm afraid that if we were to write this verses about us, it would sound like this. Let us hide, whine, complain, and hoard our resources. Put our Bibles in a drawer. Build bomb shelters. Purchase ammunition. Blame the cops. Blame the president. Blame the teachers. Blame our mamas. Demand our rights. Build a wall. Tax the rich. Play it safe. Find somebody to sue. Take back our country. Pray Jesus returns so we don't have to suffer at all. Can you imagine how we sound